Hi, everyone. My name is Becky Robinson. Welcome to the Abundant Community webinar series with Peter Block and John McKnight and today's special guest, Mike Butler. As you're coming online, we want to invite you to chat with us in the chat throughout today's event. We would love to hear your comments and questions, and we will bring those into the discussion throughout the hour. So if you could take a moment to find your chat window and maybe say hello to us, tell us why it's important for you to be here. Leslie is available as our chat host and will be talking with you. And I would invite you to select all panelists and attendees so that everyone who's on today's event will have the opportunity to hear and see your comments. I happen to be calling in today from rainy Florida, and we would love to hear where you're calling in from. I know Mike is in Colorado, and Peter in Cincinnati, and John in Evanston, Illinois. So take a moment, find the chat, and say hello. We also want to let you know that we will be recording today's broadcast. So in the event that you have some friends who might benefit from today's conversation, we would invite you to share this recording with them after the event. So hello from Yorktown, Virginia. We're going to get started again in just a moment, and a reminder to everyone that we are recording live, and also we will be broadcasting. We are broadcasting live on Facebook. So welcome to some friends in Dayton, Ohio, and Cleveland, Ohio, and Jim in Cincinnati. It's good to see you, Jim. Again, welcome to the Abundant Community with Peter Block and John McKnight, our special guest, Mike Butler. And Peter, I'm going to invite you to introduce Mike and talk about and frame up today's conversation, and I'll be back with all of you toward the end of the hour.
Thank you, Becky. So this conversation means a lot. Years and years ago, I heard of a guy named John McKnight. This AT&T executive started giving me his pamphlets, and I became a follower of John. And then I get this strange call, and I always like strange calls, from a police chief in Longmont, Colorado. He said, "We're having a community building day on Saturday. Would you mind joining us?" And I said, "No, that's great." And so I go there, and he said, "We're holding it in a church." And I remember getting lost because the church looked like an office building. So that was a precursor of the mega church. And I go in there and about to give my little talk, and who's sitting in the back of the room with John McKnight. And that became probably a 25-year friendship, partnership, authorship, being together. And Mike, your consciousness as a police chief created that possibility for all of us. And I'm just so happy to have you around, and you're still in the job. And that's interesting in itself. I don't know how long you've been a police chief, but it's got to be, what, 20-some years. Anyway, Mike, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah. You're welcome, and thank you.
Yeah, so there's so many things to talk about, but as we were chatting, you talked about how connected you are to neighborhoods, and your job as a police chief is to shift people's thinking about community. They're thinking about each other. Could you just talk about what you find so compelling about the work that you do, and from the position of an officer of the law?
So yes, and so we see our role as much bigger than just law enforcers. As I said before, oftentimes police departments are kind of seen as a necessary evil in communities, when in fact they can serve as a force for social good and can make a lot of great things happen in communities. And so we've headed down that road. In fact, I just had a conversation with my staff about new ideas and perspectives that we might have in order to enlarge that role. So we do have the role of enforcement. There's no question about that. But we also take our jobs and our profession here in police and fire in terms of saying what can we do to engage our community more. And so we actually get to the point of making invitations to our community and can hand off people who say yes to those invitations to a group in our community called Helping Hands. That's 2,000 strong now, that have joined a volunteer group that says, if you need us, call us, and we're ready to do anything for you. And so we keep on enlarging that group over time. And so police officers and firefighters also walk neighborhoods and are making these invitations. And so it started with a good friend of mine, Dan Benavides, and I, back in July of 14, walking neighborhoods to encourage people to feel and believe they belong to our community. And with every one of those conversations, we make an invitation to people to become more engaged or ask what their interest is. And so we believing that that those folks need to be part of how we identify the problem, how we identify the solution, and certainly their sense of accountability and their willingness to take action to move forward with that. So we do a lot of that, but internally we also do things. We've done quite a bit of restorative justice, and it's a community-based process in which community members are actually running these processes themselves. Instead of arresting or summoning people, we refer people to that. Over the years, we have referred over 6,000 people that we might call offenders to this restorative process. And for every one of those cases, there's a victim. And for every one of those cases, there's people in the community that represent the community as well. And so literally thousands of people in this community of 100,000 have become engaged in restorative practices and apply restorative principles to typically what would be referred to the criminal justice system, where the force of retribution is in play. So we have turned a corner, not only in changing our culture here within police, but changing our community's culture in terms of how we define justice, and no longer seen necessarily as a pound of flesh or an ounce or an eye for an eye, but seeing it in a much bigger way in terms of where people choose accountability, where relationships are important, where respect, reintegration are important to move forward, to sustain kinds of solutions where people don't recommit, don't recidivate, where victims it become a centerpiece of the conversation, and where healing really does take place with the person who's committed the harm and with the person who's been harmed.
What's your take on the heroin and addiction epidemic in this culture? I'm interested in how you see it, and then you can get specific about what you do about it.
Yeah, well, thank you. And so, these are symptoms of something much deeper inside people who are struggling with, whether it's opiates, whether it's heroin, whether it's methamphetamine, even alcohol. Addiction with chemical substance can ruin lives. And so what's behind all of that is where we go, whether it's people who've been traumatized, they often live in isolation, they often live disconnected. And so what we've done over time is, about 2 years ago, we implemented a program we call the Angel Initiative, in which anyone struggling with a chemical substance addiction can walk through our front door and say, I'm addicted. They can bring their drugs, they can bring their paraphernalia, and we'll just destroy that stuff. And for everybody that has walked through our front doors, we have found treatment. We have agreements with over 100 addiction treatment service providers who provide free treatment to people who have walked through our front doors. And to date, we've leveraged probably close to $3 million in treatment that people would not necessarily have. People who have insurance or the financial wherewithal can find that, but there's a lot of folks, including folks who are struggling with homelessness, who are also struggling with addiction, can't find that. So we're now a community in which everyone in our community has access to treatment. Not only that, but we've enlisted our community to help out as kind of pseudo sponsors. They take people back and forth from treatment. We have found businesses who are willing to employ people who are in recovery, and we work with apartment complexes and other affordable housing institutions, and we ask them to provide beds for people who don't have housing. They're struggling with addiction and or their mental health, to kind of move over into that arena a little bit. So we don't just have a program that's internal to this. We have a program in which we have invited and made a place for the community to engage in a much bigger way. And frankly, what I've learned over time, especially through these walks, Peter and John, is that people have gifts. They just don't know how to offer them. And they just don't, and they want to. And so you have to go into this thinking that the goodness of your community can play out and play out in very specific ways. And I think it's up to us, some level in government, to create those mechanisms and structures where that space is created for people to really engage and to bring who they are into this midst as we work with people. So it's not just a government program, it's not just a treatment program. It's a program in which people in our community are embracing others. So
now, people go into law enforcement and firefighting probably for reasons other than the way you're describing the world. And so I'm interested in how you managed to utilize the fire station, which is one of the, in addition to churches and libraries, one of the most localized, decentralized. It's something more than waiting for a fire.
We do that. In fact, they're part of walking neighborhoods with us, and
really?
They get out into the community. I mean, there's time often between calls for service, not just fires. They don't just respond to fires.
Right.
Vast majority of America's fire service, if not everybody, 70% of the work is involved with medical calls. And so they're also engaged with this effort as well and deal with addiction, mental health, and yeah.
When you hire them, do they know what they're getting into?
Yes, they do. In fact, we've changed profiles of those we hire so that people are more relationship oriented in their perspective. We don't want to hire lone cowboys or people who want to not work as a team. We hire people who are predisposed to want to become more engaged in relationships and feel comfortable doing that, not just the traditional work that police and fire have typically done.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Out of all of this, Mike, I'm wondering, because people will still, I think, measure police departments by an indicator called crime, that how does all of this, in an accumulated sense, affect the traditional crime statistics? Do you see any relationship?
Yeah, we do. And when you consider a town of 100,000, and you look at 6,000 plus cases that have been referred to restorative justice, the recidivism rates of less than 10% versus the criminal justice system, which is 50 to 70%.
That's fantastic.
When you start doing that kind of math, you start seeing crime go down. And so at one point we had 5,000, almost 5,000 Part 1 crimes in our community. We've gone down below 3,000, and we attribute a lot of this to lack of recidivism on the part of people who have been in the system or people who now don't even go into the system, and their recidivism rates are less than 10%. So, and the other part of this is, sometimes when we've arrested people for possession of narcotics or for something related to their addiction, we now have a program in which we work through a harm reduction model called LEAD, in which we give people opportunities to go another path. And so not only with people who have committed crimes that they're struggling with addiction or their mental health. So, and these people, I mean, I can repeat numbers of people that we've encountered who we've gone on thousands of calls for service that we don't go on anymore. And so that's just one indicator. And of course, they're not committing crimes. They're not utilizing public safety or government resources as much. They're not impacting emergency departments. And so, and we get a community that literally, I mean, I don't know if we have enough time, but it's amazing to see what our community has done in terms of seeing addiction differently, seeing mental health differently, seeing people not being as fearful, and seeing their role and seeing what they can actually individually do to help. And so, and I line this at some level with tragedies that have occurred in our country in terms of when I talk to high school kids, I say, who knows in this community, who knows in this school, people who are alone, who eat lunch alone, who seem friendless, who may seem a little odd, and everyone raises their hand, we all know that, and invite those high school students to approach them and to let them know they have worth and value. I mean, we're trying, we may never be able to I don't want to say we won't never be able to eliminate these kinds of tragedies that occur, but we can certainly decrease the probabilities of them occurring if we can figure out a way to let people know that they belong, more people they belong, and especially people who don't feel that way. So, so we're working on a lot of that, and that gets to the underlying, we think the underlying sometimes issues or causes of people feeling isolated, people feeling disconnected from
it's a cause of violence, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. And now you've been through a variety of administrations, and you've chosen not to run for mayor so far, I've heard. How do you manage? I mean, you must have a pretty solid base for such a long period of time to have such a radical and humanistic point of view about law enforcement. Is it any challenges there in terms of shifting councils and shifting elected officials? And
Of course there is, but I think the bigger challenge is one in community, and we just don't focus on changing our internal culture. We really do focus
right
on our community, and if you can bring our community along, the politics typically comes along with it.
Interesting.
No matter what party they're in, and so
doesn't matter, right?
So it doesn't matter. But I also spend time with our elected officials, and we have a lot of elected officials who embrace this over time, no matter where they're coming from, where their politics are. I mean, if you're solving problems by thinking through new possibilities, people see the potential effectiveness in that, and it's hard to argue.
That's amazing.
We've talked about the effect on the community and on police officers. Can you say something about the effect of the restorative process on the people who are offenders? You've seen that up close. What happened?
So let me just back up to that question, John, and say, I think we need to figure out new goals for our criminal justice system, and I'll get to this. One is, how do we keep our communities safe? Number two, how do we minimize recidivism? And number three, how do we help victims of crime heal and become more whole? And so that third one is the one you're approaching and talking about. And with restorative practices, the victim's voice becomes the centerpiece. And they get to talk about how this has impacted them, how they felt harmed, how they have felt wounded. And so oftentimes when they actually, there's a healing process that goes with knowing that their voice counts and that they're being valued. And so going from being victimized from a crime and feeling like you have some control over the outcome of whatever's happening in terms of what this looks like is powerful for people. And so that's one way in which we do that. But I also want to really emphasize that the goals of our criminal justice system, which are still rather antiquated and primitive, need to be, I think, founded in more what I'll call forces of the universe that can come into play that speak specifically to how do we keep our communities safe or make them safer. How do we deal with people who have committed crime to minimize their recidivism? How do we get them to become more accountable to not only the victim, but to the community and to themselves? And how do we create a place for victims to begin to heal? And that's a lot of what we're doing with this. And so it's a new way of doing business, but it's also one that I think gets beyond the futility that a lot of people, professionals within the criminal justice system, feel.
There's a question here about how do you get in your own neighborhood, your own community, restorative thinking launched. One person here says they have a job as a safety and community engagement coordinator, and so they're very supportive of what you're saying. But how does Jeff launch this in Gilbert, Arizona? That's what he wants to know.
Well, I'd be happy to talk to Jeff on a one-on-one level for certain, because that's an answer that goes a long ways. But you got to keep in mind that there's no overnight sprint process going on here. Oftentimes it's one person, one room at a time. It's a process in which you have to find champions for people in your community that are willing to embrace this. And you're not just a one-person show, but you're many people. You leverage that many people power in talking to other people who do have sanctioned power, whether they're school boards, city councils, county commissioners, police departments. And so but the important thing is you have to believe that this is the way to go. You got to believe that, because it's always a 3 steps forward, 2 steps back operation. But I'd be happy to have more conversation with anybody. In fact, I've been asked to go all over the place around the country to figure out. I apologize, my light just went off. There you go. And because there's a lot to this, and there's a lot of history here, and there's a lot of people. The question to ask is how, and my first answer to that is, if you believe it, as you talk about so well in your book, the answer to how is yes, is you'll figure it out. So but I'd be happy to talk specifics with anybody.
Well, I think you are talking specifics, and somebody's in from Dayton say whether this model might have benefits in my area. So of course Dayton, has been in the news, and I really think what you just said though is an answer to that. You decide that this matters, and you find all the ears that you can, and that's great.
Mike, can I ask about, you used the 2 words a little earlier, harm reduction. And behind harm reduction is an idea that I think is a turning point in some communities. Can you say a little more about what that means and how it gets affected?
Of course. So harm reduction is a model, if you will. It's a framework for relationship in terms of when we encounter someone who's struggling with either addiction or mental health issues, is meeting them where they're at, respecting and honoring where they're at in that moment. And typically folks they have some desire, sometimes it's minimal, sometimes it's more, in terms of wanting to take another path. And so we work with them, we're very relationship oriented in what we do with our outreach. Our officers, I'm going to just say this, we just don't respond in crisis. Our officers do a lot of follow-up with people, and our staff does a lot of follow-up with people, because sometimes we become the only relationship they have.
How do you do that? What's a follow-up look like? Is it a knock on the door?
Going to where they're at and knocking on their door and engaging with them, and with a question that says, I care, or the response says, I care, how are you? What can we do for you? What's happening today? But we refer people to resources and services as well when they're ready. And so we don't push anything. We don't push treatment. We don't push abstaining. We really find out where they're at, and we help themselves recover and regain their dignity, and help them understand how they can begin to be part of another way of living their lives. And so we believe, as Dr. Perry talks about as a neuroscientist, that healthy relationships are perhaps the most healing force we have on this planet, whether you're a kid or whether you're adult, or no matter what you're struggling with or dealing with. And so we've kind of structured what we do around healthy relationships. And so that's when I said before, we hire people who are more predisposed to be in a relationship and create relationships. And any city can do this with police and fire. We have this incredibly legitimate, different, unique platform that we can leverage to do these things that may seem unique and kind of odd at first, but that gets into that whole idea of changing ourselves from a necessary evil to a force for social good. So
there's a lot of people chatting who'd love to have those conversations, so we may have to organize them, just to let you know. If you said, I'd like to talk more, we can organize that. Or if you have a specific question, let it have us now. I'm wondering if it'd be a time to take some questions. Becky, are you, I know you're there. Do you have anybody coming on, or do you want to
Yes, we are. We
invite
are.
phone-ins or something?
Yeah, we are working to identify folks to bring them on camera and ask some questions, and we do have lots of interest and involvement from attendees. So I'm going to invite you, if you are interested in coming on camera. It looks like, Sheila, perhaps you might be interested in coming on camera. If you can let me know in the chat, and I'll go ahead and bring you over. Just be aware that at times you may have some audio interference, and so if you can be prepared and your line is good and you have a camera, we'd love to be able to allow you to talk. So Sheila, I'm going to try to bring you on over so that you can talk with us today. Just in one moment. So Sheila, it looks like you're muted. If you'd like to unmute your microphone and engage in conversation with Mike and John, if you are able to unmute. And if there are others who would like to join us on camera to talk, we'd be happy to bring you. JB, you're asking a really interesting question here. He says, Mike, assuming you previously had a traditional view and approach to law enforcement, what was it? What experience tipped you over and changed your view and approach? Really
and thank you for that question. And it's a belief that, you know, we're here for each other, and we kind of, we're all in this together. And I'm getting a lot of background noise, no more. So, and I will say some of what inspired me is what Peter wrote. I've read other things that that align with that. That says that, you know, I've had certain experiences in my life that have led me to believe that that's the case. And everyone has value, everyone has worth, and that there's other ways, there's other forces in the universe, if you will, beyond retribution that potentially, I think, probably are actually more powerful, more sustainable, and more effective. And they're here for us in our midst to build structures and mechanisms like restorative practices and justice. I mean, it uses the forces of relationship, of respect, of choosing accountability, of responsibility, apology, and forgiveness. If you start building those kinds of mechanisms, you almost have to trust that those kinds of forces, as they manifest through those mechanisms, are going to be effective. You have to trust that. But we all know that the force of retribution only goes so far.
So was there any particular turning point in your life and career, Mike, that helped you come to that belief system?
40, 50 years ago. That's when it started, when I was a young man, and I became, my faith changed, my beliefs changed, and my perspective and outlook towards humanity changed.
Mike, can I ask another more general question? And that is, it seems to me, I'm pretty old, and I have never seen our nation as fearful as it is now. And it seems to me that in one sense, the police and law enforcement people are supposed to protect us from fear. Could talk a little bit about the question of fear and your relationship to it, security and safety as against fear.
And it's a great question, and it underlies a lot, John. And you know, we know that people are often impacted by what they see in terms of the news and the media. It highlights what's not going well. And my phraseology that is, for everything that's going not well, there's 1,000 things that are going well. And here's kind of the proof for that. And so that narrative doesn't get told. It's the narrative of the one that gets talked about. And that's enough. And that often is, fear is often a kind of an underlying concern that a lot of people have. They think if something is happening somewhere else, it's happening to their community as well. So we address that. We address that often in our community in terms of, and when I go to other communities and talk about this, the first question I ask is, what's going well in your community, what's happening that's good, and let's talk about that, and how do we leverage that. So it's a different conversation, and I know that it's a conversation that people are not used to having, but that's where you have to go, and that's what you have to leverage, because I don't care what community it is. I know El Paso experienced great tragedy, Dayton, going back to Ferguson, or any community where kind of the media made it look like there's just huge problems. If you go underneath what all that is, you're going to find a lot of goodness. And if you start walking neighborhoods, you start walking and you see people in the community one-on-one, and you begin to see all the great things that are going on, you'll shift your consciousness and awareness around what's happening. And so I can go on and on and on around that, John, but that's the reality. That is the reality. And what I'm very careful of in here is not unnecessarily scaring the community. Sometimes we have to deal with circumstances that are not pleasant. And sometimes we need the community's help. But we're very careful about not scaring the community. I want our council to not scare the community. I want elected official wannabes platforms to not scare the community. And so we do a lot of things to minimize that, and also at the same time infuse that there's a lot of things that are going well. And so we do have Facebook, social networks that talk about all the great things that are happening, not just what's happening with crime or disorder or whatever that might look like. But it's an underlying, I think it's an underlying thing, that force that we have to reckon with, we have to reconcile with, because until we can turn that around, we're still going to go down. Fear is, kind of leads to how do we minimize what we're afraid of, and so that becomes our strategy.
Thanks. Sorry, I had to leave for a second. So what's the newspaper? How do they write about you? What do they make of you? How you're such a outside the norm of investigative journalism. How do they write about you? If
we have a couple.
Put you above the fold, or
we have a few media outlets here in the community, and we have one that really is on, kind of understands this. And yesterday I did a podcast with them. We have a newspaper that's tied to a conglomerate that serves as a national conglomerate that's run by a hedge fund that is different around how they see this. And so I've actually written editorials to the newspaper around how the media could become different. I was saying earlier, there's the broadcast station, a major broadcast station out of Denver, invited me to come on to talk about this very issue. They didn't like what I was saying around how the media, I think, the narrative in the media, and so they invited me to come on. We actually had a great conversation. They actually changed their format and started talking about more things that were good.
You're really talking about restorative journalism, aren't you?
In a way, I am, because those principles respond. They apply everywhere, and not just with justice, but they apply everywhere.
Interesting.
Mike, one other thing I wanted to ask you about. When you're thinking about the criminal justice system, it's the state versus somebody. And that very idea, it seems to me, that I didn't offend you, I offended the state, is something that you're undercutting in a way. And I wonder if you could speak about that kind of shift as to what is the state's role and what is the community's role? And you're shifting that, it seems to be, in a radical way.
Well, we're shifting, but we're also basically utilizing both systems.
Sure.
What we're not good at, John and Peter, is determining who needs to be separated out from society and who can work with other mechanisms and structures to help them take another path, so they're not just identified by one event that occurred, or maybe a series of things that are that are a result of their health issues. But you're exactly right. Restorative practices, justice, and principles makes it very personal, and it's not a crime against the state. It's not professionals that are trying to resolve the issue, whether it's police, whether it's prosecutors, whether it's judges. It's one-on-one with people who have committed the harm and the people who are harmed, and through those kinds of facilitated restorative conversations, we get to a much better and different place where people are choose accountability, where people feel like their voice is heard. And so, in essence, it's that. But what's interesting too is we now have our DA's office who prides themselves in using restorative practices. We have judges that now want to use restorative practices. We have police departments now around us that are more interested in restorative practices. So the word is spreading, if you will, because everyone within the criminal justice system, as well meant as they want to be, they know that what they're doing isn't working. And
So somebody asked, what's the value proposition you make? Somebody says, what are some of the strategies to get buy-in from criminal justice professionals? Is what you're telling us kind of what you tell them, which is the outcomes you get?
Very same thing. And what we've done in restorative justice that we've had in this community for 25 years is we have a track record. Yeah. And they see the data. Data is often one of the things that people want to see. And so we have data. We have data from our Angel Initiative, from our mental health programs and our LEAD. So we know that data can often be, people want to know what the facts are, what the data shows. Yeah. So we keep that and we show it to people, and it's hard to argue with.
But what keeps you interested? So you've been at this a while. You know what you're talking about.
Let me just say this, and I'm not going to give too much away here, but I'm more near the end than I am the beginning. And I have a lot left in my tank that I want to be able to do other things. Not one of them is not political. The political system needs a lot of work in order for it to really become effective, and we could go on and on about that. But there's other things I'm thinking about that I want to do, where I want to leverage what I have left in my tank to move these along, because sometimes in this role that I play as public safety chief or police or fire chief, people put me in a certain box, and anything that comes out outside of that box doesn't necessarily sound good.
That's great. I'm waiting for the book and the documentary and the full-length movie. That'll be exciting.
Yeah.
And also, Mike, is if people were interested in the data that you collected through time,
sure,
a piece of information that might help in their persuasive efforts other places, is it available?
It's available.
Where?
They can contact me, and I will make it available for them. And so some of it's on our website, Longmont Public Safety, but the vast majority of it is in our files and in the work we're doing. And I'm available at mike.butler@longmontcolorado.gov, G-O-V, mike.butler@longmontcolorado.gov. You're welcome to get in touch with me, and whatever you need, we will provide.
I love it. You have that accessibility available to people at the personal level. Keep it personal, and it might work.
It's the only way to do it.
Yeah.
So we have Sheila on the line, and she did unmute a while ago, and I think is waiting to chat with the three of you. So Sheila, welcome.
Hello, everybody. How are you guys doing?
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
okay,
you sound great.
Yes, Sheila.
I Mr. Block. How you been? It's been a long time since I saw or heard from you. It's been a while.
All right, thank you.
Anyway, great. Thanks for having this conversation. I think it's a very prominent conversation. And as you guys say, I'm the director of the Trauma Recovery Center here in Cincinnati, Ohio, at 7 Hills Neighborhood House. And you guys got some stuff going on that's very interesting, especially the accountability and the relationship piece that you were speaking about, Mr. Butler, and the work that you are doing within the community. I think that is very vital. We have been focusing on some of the exact same things that you're talking about, and I think community is very, very important in these pieces. we have been utilizing different trainings and allowing our community to be a part of. And they have actually been able to utilize their training skills in the community throughout different issues and things that have been coming up, which I'm finding to be very helpful for the community and themselves and their families. What we're realizing is that preventative measures are very needed in these situations, allowing people to know how to prevent things from happening, not only to try to stop them. But I just wanted to commend you guys on this conversation and the model that you're speaking on. I've been having a little conversation with Dr. Garcia and Kenneth Parker, and they were talking about some things they were doing. So I think together we can get this thing going, and I would very much love to be a part of anything you guys are moving forward with. And I would also like to share some of the great work that we are doing here at the Trauma Recovery Center. We have a building at this time, and we're working very hard to have something like maybe a safe haven or something, like you were saying, struggling with the bed issues, because we're having a high volume of calls, like from hospitals, from different clients that we work with that need that moment to be safe, you know, in between finding that place at the, even for us getting housing, while they're waiting to get their mental health clinicians in order, getting their medications filled. So we're really working hard on moving our facility outside of Seven Hills Neighborhood House, which is a wraparound center now, and into its own entity, which I think will be very prominent and make a positive effect with all of these things that we're talking about.
Sheila, thank you so much, and I appreciate that kind of service. We're kindred spirits. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Sheila.
What makes us unique is, you know, that they funded 5 organizations, and we were the only community-based, so we're out on the ground. We're out in the community.
Where you gotta be.
We work.
Where you gotta be.
Yeah, so we appreciate you guys, and I would love to stay connected with all of you guys. Thank you, Becky.
Thank you,
Great to hear from you.
We appreciate you joining.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a question here from Mary, a really deep one. Mary is curious about how restorative justice principles and processes can be used to heal victims who may still be suffering as a result of crimes that occur during serious conflicts. And she's specifically referencing some events in Northern Ireland. You know, obviously in the US, we have lots of recent events. So Mike, could you speak a little bit to how these restorative justice approaches can help victims heal?
And, you know, and I'll use the phrase restorative principles and restorative practices. And I very much relate to those folks who have been victimized by violence. Oftentimes that can be very personal in nature. And by someone maybe you trust, or someone that you were in love with, or whatever that might look like. And those are often the worst. And there is very much room on this planet to heal through restorative circles, restorative practices and principles. Sometimes it takes a while for people to get to a point where they're ready to sit down at the table with that person or people who have victimized them. And we see that. We see that a lot sometimes in prison, where restorative practices are used with victims or people whose a family member has been murdered, and the person who's in jail. And part of their healing process is they recognize it is to meet with that person. And those are delicate, fragile conversations that have to be treated in a way where we don't re-victimize the person through this process. And so there's ways of doing that. But oftentimes victims, this is all voluntary on the part of victims and offenders. You can't force this to happen. And so oftentimes victims kind of choose their own timing on this. It's not necessarily something that happens right away. And oftentimes they have to get to a stable, safe, more healing place within themselves before they're ready to do that. But I will tell you that it's very doable. We've done it. And it's something that I think is driven more by the victim's sense of timing than anything else.
Beautiful. Becky, do you have somebody that wants to say something?
I do. I have Sean Ed. who's going to join us and has some questions about the training that folks receive as a part of this type of process. Thank you, Shawned.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon. Sorry, I wasn't thinking I was going to be on the video, but here we are. We're very fortunate. Thank you for having me and for this fantastic conversation. I'm calling in from Canada, and we have a pretty robust restorative justice practice on the North Shore, where I am the executive director of the North Shore Restorative Justice Society.
Wow.
One of the challenges we run into, and we work very closely with our both policing bodies in our community. We have RCMP and then also a municipal police force. And although we've got great support and champions in the leadership position, it doesn't always trickle down. And I'd be really curious, Mike, to hear about how you've supported the training of new recruits that come in who possibly don't come in with any background in this, who have a certain perception about, you know, bad guys, and I'm generalizing, I know, but you know, how do we create that sort of groundswell necessary to really showcase the value and of, yeah, so I'll leave it at that, but
I got it. Thank you. And so let me just say that I talked a little bit about the people we hire. If you hire law enforcers, that's a more challenging proposition than if you're changing the profile to hire people who have kind of a wider breadth of attributes that include want to be involved and want to create engaging relationships. But two things that cops really respond to. One is people choosing accountability. And second, the plight of the victim. There's no one that sees the plight of the victim more in its rawest form than police officers. And they want to see those people taken care of. I sense that all the time with our police. And I sense that cops, when they see people over and over again in the criminal justice system, thinking and knowing that the criminal justice system doesn't work, and they're seeing these people over and over again, that if you can somehow highlight the fact that recidivism rates and that people taking more accountability plays out much more with restorative practices and principles, those two things mean a lot to police officers. Mm-hmm. And so I would say that, but I would also say that changing the culture of police and or fire is not necessarily easy. And you have to stay with that, and you have to start, there's champions within every organization. We have 17 people, police officers, that serve as liaisons with our local restorative justice services. Wow. So we've created a collateral assignment which police officers are now flocking to become part of that effort. And they're actually the ones that are championing the principles of restorative practices to our fellow police officers. And so it's a building process that takes time. You promote people who are interested in this. You select people who are interested in this. People go from one position to another desired position who are interested in this. And so you put it out there at some level as a value, as a principle that we're very much attached to. It doesn't become a program. It becomes part of the philosophy of who you are, what you do, and how you do it. Mm-hmm. And so you have to have that kind of inertia with certain kinds of strategies. Then you have to just stick with it. And I do talk a lot about how you change police cultures within organizations and what that looks like to go from an organization that's mostly just bad guy oriented, enforcement oriented, to an organization that can think and react and respond much differently given the social and health issues that we're confronting. So there's a lot to be said there, but I initially just gave you that aspect of it. I'd be happy to have more conversation with you and or the RCMP or your police around that if they are in fact interested. I'm going to be doing a webinar on changing police cultures here soon, and so I can let you know more about that then too.
I'd love to, and I've got your email, so you'll certainly be hearing from me. Thank you so much for all that you do. It's very inspiring.
Best wishes.
Cheers. Thank you.
When is the webinar?
It hasn't been dated, and I'm doing it through an organization called LEAP, the Law Enforcement American Police. It's a rising organization, LEAP. I'm not 100% sure what it stands for, but it's law
Doesn't
enforcement.
matter.
And so I'm going to be working with them, and they've become an organization nationally that's very interested in changing police response. And so I've been working with them. They've hooked me up with various communities around the country and around doing certain things differently. And so keep LEAP in mind in terms of that. So we're going to be putting that together and doing it. So
That's awesome. Well, you're just, it's wonderful listening to you. It's like you have such a great philosophy, Mike, and infinite patience and understanding. And it's stunning in the midst of the world we're living in. Okay.
Well, the other thing I will respond to, having 5 daughters has increased my patience. I sometimes wonder if women weren't put on this planet to civilize and socialize us men. And if you were to ask my daughters, they'd probably say they have more work to do with me.
Exactly. How's it going? Exactly.
On that point, Mike, have you noticed any difference in terms of the role of women as police officers?
Of course. There's plenty of room for the attributes that women bring that are different than men, and we need them all. We need all of those attributes, and so yes, and and I find actually with the millennial generation, I don't even know if it's called millennial, if that's the right term, but they're very attached to social responsibility, and police departments all over the country are struggling to find qualified applicants. We're not, and I think one of the reasons why is when they begin to see who we are, that we're attached more to our community and more in different ways along the lines that I've talked about. And I think our that generation's more drawn to that kind of service that can be more impactful, and they're right there in the midst of it. And so I would put that out there as a recruitment strategy for any police department to consider, that if you're struggling with finding qualified applicants, kind of maybe change the way we're doing business, and the qualified applicants will flow.
That's awesome. So I think we're near the end. Any final thoughts, John, you have, or then I'll ask Mike you the same question.
Yeah, Mike, I'm still interested in the transformative effect of this kind of process on people we call offenders. And I wonder if you could say something about that. What happens in this process to the people that are looked down on, are sanctioned?
Well, let me say, John, that one of the things we do in our restorative process is that we actually talk about within the conference or circle itself the wonderful attributes that the offender has, and so we emphasize and reflect back the goodness and the wonderfulness that they have, and oftentimes that's a first for them.
Yes.
And so they begin, and so we spend quite a bit of time with them, and so each of those folks are important. They have value. They have something to offer, and many times these offenders become community representatives down the road because they have perspective on who they are. And so I come from a perspective that there's a piece of us, that there's a higher good in each of us. And if you talk to that, and if you can reflect back what that really is inside people, and you talk to that part of people, that it's amazing how people respond back to that.
That's beautiful. I also want to circle back what you said in the beginning. You said you have a helping hand organization of volunteers of a couple of thousand people, which is like 2% of your community. And building that, in my imagination, is as powerful as training police officers. Because there's only going to be so many officers, and you can talk, but to have built over time 2,000 people who can do the restorative practice in other ways, that's a powerful outcome.
It is, and the idea is to build a lot of these organizations where those oftentimes what government does is they build programs, and they're built in isolation in a way that only systems or professional government people, service providers can do.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the next evolution of these kinds of how these programs or structures are built is to create a place and a space for people in the community to become just as engaged.
Yeah, John, you and I talk a lot about what it means to be a citizen.
Yeah.
And the capacity to produce your own well-being instead of outsourcing it to paid professionals. And it seems to me the restorative pathway is a great way of speaking of what it means to be a citizen, what it is to reclaim your neighborhood as your own. And to me, you're building social capital. That's work is just stunning, especially in this world where we've become more afraid of the stranger. You just don't buy the dominant narrative. No amount of persuading is going to influence you. And I bet those 2,000 people you're working with feel the same way.
And there's more than that, 2,000.
Yeah, 20,000.
Organization, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And Mike, it seems to me that what you're doing is you're redefining the function of the police and redefining the function of the community, so that the idea that something called crime is all to be directed to a system is why we failed, I think. And what your profound insight is that the central action in terms of our dealing with security and deviance is in the community, and not to pass that off to a system. It's our function to say, this person is ours. We produce this person, and we need ways to
embrace them,
this person's, so that they can remain in our community and be a benefit. It's just superb.
We're going to close in a minute, but let me have one question. Okay, I'm on a neighborhood council, and once a month we sit there for 2 hours, act interested. Okay, and we always begin with the police and fire report, and they tell us how many crimes are up, down, and the fires tells us how many of this. Is there any use for that report?
It has limited value because it defines what's wrong.
Thank you.
And I think we have to become better at defining what's working well. And I'm convinced, whether it's a person, an organization, a community, or a country, that if you accentuate the strengths and the gifts and what people have to offer, that you're more likely, and all about assets, John and Peter, but that has to be taken to an entirely different level. And so we're defined as safe or unsafe by the level of crime, not by the level of goodness or the level of great things that are going on. And so they have limited value, and they're really distorted documents, because
I know
not everybody reports crime. So
yeah, exactly. And at one time they even started listing the 7 people they'd arrested in the last month. And I stopped them. I said, don't do that. I thought they were innocent until proven guilty. But anyway, thanks for the confirmation for my own feelings. Whether I'll be able to change that or not, I don't know. I'd have to go to one of your workshops or webinar. So
well, I want to make sure, I'm sorry for interrupting, Peter. I want to make sure everyone
time.
knows about our next event. We will be back together with Peter Block and John McKnight on September 24th with Sarah Arthurs, and we'll be talking about the topic of co-housing. So for all that who joined today, we hope to see you back. I guess that's next month.
Well, thanks so much, Mike and Becky and everybody. It was just wonderful to see you again.
Yeah, likewise, Peter and John. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike.
Appreciate all you're doing.
Yeah.
Take care.
All right. Take care of yourselves.